Our next speaker has been at the forefront of empowering historically underserved cities across the United States with a targeted, data-driven approach to transform the economic models of despair. He's a classically trained musician and a former orchestra conductor, and has served as the Chief Administrative Officer for the city of Jackson, Mississippi, where he led a strategic plan focused on early childhood success, financial empowerment, and equitable workforce development. Now, as Senior Executive and Director for the National League of Cities, Institute for Youth, Education, and Families, he works to help connect, train, and empower cities and towns of all sizes with federal funds made available to aid in pandemic recovery and invest in local infrastructure. Please welcome Robert Blaine.
Thank you. It is a pleasure to be with you today. I really wish I was with you in person. I'm here in Washington, D.C., and Banff, Canada sounds like a wonderful, wonderful place to be right now, other than being in D.C. But I wanted to speak briefly with you today about a program that we've been working on at the National League of Cities, really thinking about the equitable distribution of what has been a historic amount of funds that have come down through the American Rescue Plan and the bipartisan infrastructure law. And so one of the things that we've been able to see is that cities have been able to think about new ways that they can view how they're going to allocate resources. And what we've tried to do is to create a more data-informed approach to working with those communities. So if you look at the next slide, this is the structure of the Institute for Youth Education and Families. And we essentially have 5 verticals within the Institute that range across the lifespan of a family in a community. And part of the work was really thinking about how are we creating more equitable ways of distributing funds, especially when we start to think about resilience in the face of the pandemic. So one of the things that we were looking at was early on in this work, we were working in the Deep South in the United States, in the states of Arkansas, Mississippi, and Louisiana, what we call the Delta region. If you follow the Mississippi River down, it ends right there with these 3 states. And we have some of the greatest poverty in the country in the Delta region. And so we were looking at how we could reframe a conversation on equity and outcome for youth education and families across those communities. And what we did was we brought together a program where we put together what we called our on-the-ground navigators, who were using a framework that we developed with SPI to create needs assessments in communities. And the needs assessments were driven by the data of disparities in their communities. And so we use that to be able to cull them into action groups, and then use that as a model to provide technical assistance in order to drive federal funding to the communities that needed it the most. And the goal for us was to be able to create this framework that we could hopefully expand into a national model. So we started in the Deep South in the states of Arkansas, Mississippi, and Louisiana. We included the state of Alabama. We were then asked to expand to the Great Lakes, and we included the states of Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, and Michigan. And then we filled in the gap with Missouri. And now we're actually expanding that to the state of Maryland, Washington, and Alaska. And so our goal is that we're working with up to about 500 cities across all of those communities. So we sat down with SPI and we started to look at the framework. And we said, okay, this is the framework as we have it. would it be possible to reorganize the framework so that we can think about all of the funding streams that are available in the American Rescue Plan and then adapt the framework so that it aligned with the various outputs of the funding streams, and then use that to create indicators that we could measure down to the census tract level in every one of those communities so that we could have this hyper-local vision of what disparities look like, and then use that to think about how we could allocate federal funding streams. So, so this is the way that we broke down the American Rescue Plan. We took the three categories of basic human needs, foundations of well-being, and opportunity, and then took all of the various programs in the American Rescue Plan and started to map that out to the current FPI index. And then we reorganized the categories so that we had essentially a relief category, a housing and health category, and an economy category. And each one of those, we had sets of program related organizational structure. And then inside of each one of those programs, a set of indicators that we could measure down to the census tract level in every one of those communities. So the goal was that we could sit down with the city and we could start to have a conversation with them about what it meant to look at this local, very localized view and think about how it related to opportunities for federal funding. And so this is looking at the city of Hattiesburg, Mississippi. And here we're looking at supermarket access. And as you can see, the darker areas have the most access and the lighter areas have the least amount of access. And so one of the things that we could do in this map is that by mousing over the various regions, you could get really exact amounts of what the various levels of access were across those communities. This is looking at the same community, now looking at average broadband speed. And as you can see, the darker the color, the more access, the greater broadband speed folks have. The lighter the color, the less broadband speed they have. And so you can start to see how, for example, if we go back and forth between those two, the relief dimension shows that when we start to look at supermarket access, where those disparities are and how they align when you start to look at average broadband speed. And this became part of what we call the data story, and really trying to create a data story about a community that we could then leverage in an application for federal funding. This is another community, Indianola, Mississippi, a much smaller community, but we're looking at disconnected youth here. And this is the percentage of 16 to 19-year-olds that are neither in school or have a job. And so this was really looking at within a community, what did those kinds of disconnections mean? And especially looking at the impacts of the lack of access during the pandemic and what that meant to youth becoming disconnected from the system. And so again, it was another way of us trying to create a more of a nuanced view when we could layer this with data of, for example, broadband access or school attainment or any of these other measures that we were building into the index. So our goal when we talked to the administration was that I said that our goal was to return what we called an I told you so document, essentially a document that spoke to the efficacy of these dollars in communities if they were targeted to the communities that needed the help the most. And one of the challenges that we've seen historically when we've had some of these large funding programs is that the funds have gone to communities that were not necessarily the most in need. And so really thinking about how we could make the case for those communities and then use that to be targeted and drive funding focused on the programming that was going to change the baseline of these indicators over time. So we were approached by a philanthropy, the Bloomberg Philanthropies, to take what we were doing across these communities and expand it to a national program for all small to mid-sized cities. So we defined that as cities that were 200,000 residents and below, which is the vast majority of cities in the US. There are over 16,000 cities in the United States that are 200,000 residents and less. And so the first part of the process was that we did a survey, a little research study with a set of cities to try and understand what help they needed looking at the bipartisan infrastructure law. And there was about $135 billion worth of funds that were directly available to cities, but they were competitive grant programs. So it's all based on the quality of their grant applications. And so what they said was that they needed help sifting through the overwhelming number of grant opportunities. They needed to understand if there was some secret sauce that they needed to have in their grant applications. They didn't have much time as city officials, as city workers, to be able to dedicate to this, but they said that they could dedicate at least an hour a week to be able to develop the kinds of applications that they needed. And their preferred format for support was some kind of bespoke program with one-on-one support, as well as larger interactive webinars. And so essentially we put together a curriculum. This is essentially a set of online courses. This is just a sample curriculum looking at what would happen, how we would build out a curriculum for a lead pipe removal program. One of the things that you'll notice is that the fourth program, the whole second half of the course is all around data. How do we understand data? How do we create more empowered programs? And how are we creating what we call shovel-worthy, right? How are we using data to create shovel-worthy projects? So essentially, we built this out as a 2-year project with these various phases. And each phase has 5 different programs through the infrastructure bill, which means that total of $135 billion, we could work with cities over the course of 2 years, thousands of cities at a time, in order to be able to get them to have competitive applications for this program. So this is just a sample of how we were looking at phase 1 courses. These are looking at drinking water programs and really thinking about lead in the water. And one of the things that we've talked about was the impact of lead in the water, what that meant for early childhood outcomes, being able to measure lead in the water and then look at what the outcomes are for early childhood attainment, as well as some big metrics like the 3rd grade reading gate, and using that as a way of prioritizing how that funding is targeted to those communities, and then building in the kinds of programs that are going to truly eliminate the lead out of the water, and then to be able to think about how we're measuring whether or not we're seeing any changes in early childhood outcomes because of decreased toxicity in the water. So again, there's a really lengthy process that we go through that we're building for this. But the reason that I wanted to show this slide is because the design process is really focused around how are we developing the kinds of data needs that cities need in order to be able to do this kind of in-depth work and understand how they can be targeted, use the data to target the communities that are in greatest need. So this is a sample course schedule of how we've thought about building out that infrastructure. I think the most important piece of this is that as cities go through this process, many of these small to mid-sized cities have never engaged with federal funding like this before. And so there needed to be a bespoke, targeted program that was really leading them through a process to be able to have strongly competitive applications that aligned with the administration's goals around equity and the ways that they should build programs focused on the data, a data-driven approach of driving resources in an equitable framework. So, so this is the work that we've been doing. We're really excited about this work, and I would love to entertain any questions if anyone has them.
Hi, Carl Nelson, Better Future for All. This is a multi-year program. When do you start, or when do we start seeing the impact of this, and what do you predict or think is going to be there?
Yeah, so so we're in a bit of a design sprint right now. We're launching this program in August, so that means I have to build the team around this and build out the curricula and all of the steps and processes involved. I believe that by next year, this time, we should have our preliminary set of data on the numbers of cities that have been awarded, the amounts they've been awarded, and how that distribution has changed from historic practices. So are we seeing a redistribution of funding into communities that need it the most? And then we look at the impact of the work at 3 different levels. So we have a set of metrics that we measure at the programmatic level. So what is that discrete program itself? Then we have a set of metrics that we look at the systemic level. How are we actually changing some of the inequities in the system itself? And then the final measure is that we focus on the population level. What does this mean for the lived experience of people in that community? And are they better off because of that work? So I think that about a year through, we should be able to have some metrics on all 3 of those levels.
Is he taking job applications?
Absolutely. We are trying to spin up essentially a unit around this work, and we're spinning it up as fast as we possibly can.
Oh, sorry, just a final quick question. You know, one of the biggest things is taking that data from the data layer to information, generating knowledge based on that information, and in the striving for social progress, applying that through wisdom and replication. And so in your approach with the NLC is a replication strategy of successful approaches part of your outcome set and part of your deliberate design about we're going to involve as many people as we can so that we can replicate this as widely and as effectively as we can so that we don't all have to do this ourselves each time.
Absolutely, absolutely. One of the outcomes that we've built into the program is really thinking about long-term sustainability. So how are we creating a nation of fishermen, right? How are we redesigning the way that cities think about their approach to data? How are we inculcating that into the process that they use every day? How are we building that into the ways that they think about community engagement? All of those pieces are the ways that we're trying to hardwire this across cities across the country. And so the goal is that that we create something of a movement here, and that cities are building this data-informed approach towards equitable distribution of resources in a way that that speaks to where the disparities lie and build opportunities for to both remediate some of those challenges, but also to transform opportunities. And so I think that at the base of all of this, we're trying to build opportunity in communities and to use the more equitable distribution of resources as a way of creating a more opportune environment for all citizens across the country.
Dr. Blaine, thank you ever so much for your time. I met Dr. Blaine in Iceland at the last What Works conference, and we had a wonderful conversation about potholes, but mostly because the importance of getting the basic needs correct in order to have legitimacy in talking about well-being and opportunity, the more higher order end. We talked a lot about how similar the SPI framework is to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, minus the pyramid, of course. So it's wonderful to see Dr. Blaine's philosophy in action. Dr. Blaine, thank you ever so much for sparing the time and imparting your wisdom with us. Thank you, Dr. Blaine.
Thanks so much for having me.